John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, good friends who became fierce political rivals only to renew their friendship in old age, died on the same day, July 4th, 1826. Adams' last words famously were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He didn't know that Jefferson had in fact died a few hours previously. John Quincy Adams' last words before he died were, "This is the last of earth. I am content." Sir Winston Churchill's last words were, "I'm bored with it all." And Leonardo da Vinci's last words were, "I have offended God and mankind because my work did not reach the quality it should have." Okay, well, there was the Mona Lisa. That was not bad. So, anybody remember the last words of King David? Probably not. We tend to glorify King David, but his ending is sad, even pitiful. We don't like to think about his ending. We'd rather remember that little shepherd boy defending his flock from a bear or a mountain lion, playing music to soothe King Saul's soul, or boldly going out to face the Philistine giant Goliath. But it's how you end that matters. So today I want us to look at the last words of King David. But to understand them, I need to take you back to about 10 years before that. This time, things weren't going too well for David. He's getting old. His son Absalom begins maneuvering to take over the kingdom at David's death. In fact, he really doesn't even wait until the old man kicks the bucket. Now, Absalom isn't the oldest son. He's not even the second oldest. He's the third oldest of David's sons. But he's the one who seems most cut out for the job of king. He's handsome, charismatic, a natural leader. He's smart, clever, with just the right amount of ruthlessness about him. Absalom, his name means father of peace. In his early years, he was one of David's favorites, and he loved being the son of a king. He loved all the pomp and circumstance around the throne, and he lived in great style. He rode around in a magnificent chariot and had 50 attendants running in front of him. The people loved him. They ate all this up. If there had been tabloids and paparazzi back then Absalom would have been on the front page all the time. He was a Kardashian before there were any Kardashians. Now, what Absalom would do is he would go out early each morning by the entrance to the city. And when someone would approach the gate who had a suit to bring before the king, Absalom would start off just asking them, "Hey, where are you from?" And they'd tell him, and then he'd say, "Well, so here's the problem. My dad is trying to rule over all 12 tribes, and honestly, it's just too much for one person. All these men like yourself come from all these cities and towns from all over the place, and no one can really ever get in to see him. So they just sit around and wait and wait and wait, and then finally they just give up. What he really needs to do is delegate this work to some deputies. But the old man just insists that he can do things the way he did when he just had to rule over Judah. But now that he's got all 11 tribes under him, I mean, you gotta build a working coalition. At least that's how I would do it if I were in charge. You see what he's doing? He'd suck up to all the important men. And when they would come to give praise to him, he wouldn't accept it. They'd come to kiss his ring. He instead would kneel and kiss theirs. And he did this every morning after morning after morning. And pretty soon, he had built up quite a following. In fact, 2 Samuel 15:6 says that Absalom stole the hearts of the people of Israel. He kept at this for 4 years, and then he executes his plan for a bloodless coup. He goes to Hebron, which was David's capital before moving it to Jerusalem, and he sends word to all the men and all the tribes. As soon as you hear the trumpet sound, start chanting, "Absalom has become king at Hebron." He even had some of his father's men join him at Hebron. So when David gets word of it, he knows he has no choice but to abandon Jerusalem and flee from Absalom. But Absalom didn't get this sneaky gene from his mother's side, if you know what I mean. David's got plenty of sneak in him. So while he's fleeing, he sends one of his guys back to Jerusalem to act like he's one of Absalom's guys. But he's one of David's guys. And his job is to whisper bad advice to Absalom. So that's what he does. He sends the guy back, and then David flees. And while he's fleeing with his men, he passes by the city of Bahurim, which old King Saul still had a lot of family in. Now, remember, Saul was the first king of Israel until he fell out of favor with Samuel, who then anointed David king while Saul was still king. And so for a while, David is a fugitive on the run. He's living in the caves with his mighty men, engaging in guerrilla warfare, and all the while gaining all kinds of popular support. And eventually, David and Saul engage in a civil war, which weakens the forces of Saul and makes him even more vulnerable to Israel's traditional enemies, the Philistines. And Saul dies when the Philistines defeat him in a major battle at Mount Gilboa. But apparently, Saul's family has never forgotten David's treachery, and they blame him for Saul's death. So as David passes by the city of Bahurim, one of Saul's family comes out. So why don't we read this part? 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 5. When King David came to Bahurim, a man of the family of the house of Saul came out, whose name was Shimei, son of Gera. He came out cursing. He threw stones at David and at all the servants of King David. Now all the people and all the warriors were on his right and on his left. Shimei shouted while he cursed, "Out! Out! Murderer! Scoundrel! The Lord has avenged on all of you the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. And the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. See, disaster has overtaken you, for you are a man of blood." Then Abishai, But the king said, "What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord has said to him, 'Curse David,' who then shall say, 'Why have you done so?'" David said to Abishai and to all his servants, "My own son seeks my life. How much more now may this Benjamite? Let him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has bidden him. It may be that the Lord will look on my distress, and the Lord will repay me with good for this cursing of me today." So David and his men went on the road, while Shimei went along on the hillside opposite him and cursed as he went, throwing stones and flinging dust at him. Now, on one level, this is just kind of comical, this guy ranting at David. It's one dude armed with rocks versus David with an army. And the guy doesn't even care. Warriors to the left of him, warriors to the right, but he doesn't care. He's foaming at the mouth, cussing his head off, kicking dust at them, taunting David. "See," he says, "what goes around comes around. You stole the throne from Saul. Now the Lord has given the throne to Absalom. Eat that." And of course, one of David's guys go, "You want me to go cut his head off?" And David says, "Nah, leave him alone. Who knows? Maybe he's right. Maybe I brought all this on myself. Maybe I'm just getting what I deserve." Now, in later years, when the Maccabees are making David the center of their Make Israel Great Again campaign and looking for the Messiah to take them back to the good old days, they spun this as a grand gesture of David's, a magnanimous act of mercy and humility from the greatest king who ever lived. who even in his lowest moment is able to look past the cursing of a man who for years has harbored such cruel hate that it's twisted him into a raging maniac. What an exemplar of forgiveness. And later on, after this incident, David's fortunes turn around, and now he's winning victories again and crushing the rebellion and regaining the popularity that Absalom had stolen from him but now couldn't hold. So now people are coming from all over to join him, and among them is this same Shimei, who comes up to him and falls before David asking for forgiveness and begging for his life. And David spares him again. I mean, what a guy, right? Okay, so that sets it all up. So let's fast forward now, about 10 years or so later, to the end of David's life. Like I said, he's retaken his throne in Jerusalem. He squashed the rebellion, and now Absalom is dead. And Solomon is getting ready to take over as king. And as David's ready to die, he calls Solomon over to give him some final words. And, you expect something David-like, something of the high poetry that we read in the Psalms, which is what we get. So check it out. 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. I am about to go the way of all the earth, David says to Solomon. Be strong, be courageous, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, so that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. All right, strong start. But then it turns dark. David starts to remember those who were loyal to him and should be treated well, and he remembers those who weren't loyal to him and should be treated, well, And so then here are his absolute final words. He says to Solomon, there is also with you Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, who cursed me with a terrible curse on the day when I went to Mahanaim. But when he came down to meet me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, I will not put you to death with the sword. Therefore, do not hold him guiltless, for you are a wise man. You will know what you ought to do to him, and you must bring his gray head down with blood to Sheol. And then David slept with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. For 10 years, David had harbored this resentment. He fed it. He watered it. He allowed it to grow. On the outside, he was all about forgiveness. But on the inside, the cursing still stung. And so he tells Solomon, I promised him I would spare him, but you didn't. So you know the right thing, and I know you will do it. Those are the last words of King David. The last words of David are words of hate, of spitefulness, and of murder and revenge. By the time of the New Testament, David has been cleaned up and idolized as the perfect king, the man after God's own heart. But the books of Samuel and King, which are part of one long narrative, actually present David as a cautionary tale, as the tragic story of a good guy who starts out as a man after God's own heart, but whose heart had shrunken and been shriveled by power and by too much wealth and by resentment. David doesn't finish well. And instead of warning Solomon to learn from his mistakes and to rule better and kinder, wiser, instead of warning him of the danger of letting hurts and insults and even legitimate injuries fester, telling him that a true leader has to have thick skin and allow people to share their grievances without fear of reprisal. He blames it all on some guy who didn't matter anyway. David blamed all his problems on others when his problems were of his own doing. You know, adultery with Bathsheba, the murder of Uriah, which leads to bearing false witness, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. But even so, even if David had somehow managed to avoid these things and maintain his heart from God, there were going to be enemies. There were going to be people who hated him, not because of anything he did, but because that's what people do. When you're king, there's always someone who wants what you have, and they're going to be willing to do just about anything to get it. And you know what? What you do when that happens is still up to you. The greatest danger to a person's soul is not when they sin, but when someone sins against them. When you sin, it's your own fault, and for the most part, you know it. Even when you're in denial about it, you know that your resentment isn't righteous. But when someone sins against you, your anger is righteous. Your resentment is righteous. And your desire to see them pay and that justice is done is a righteous desire. And that's when you're in danger. Think about the parable of the prodigal son. In the parable of the prodigal son, the elder son's anger and resentment is real and it's righteous. I mean, there is not a thing that he says in anger to his father that's not true. The prodigal son dishonored the father and hence the whole family, and nothing was done. And the prodigal wasted his fortune on immoral living, and he wasn't punished for it. He's come home and he should be treated no better than a servant. But Dad's throwing a party for him. And all this time, the elder son has worked like a slave, and never once has a party been thrown for him. These are all true statements, and it's not right. It's not fair. And look what it's done to him. I mean, he genuinely hates his brother, and his resentment toward his father is deep and hurtful. The greatest danger to your soul is not when you sin, but when someone sins against you and you burn with righteous anger and righteous resentment and long for the day when God wreaks vengeance on them. And the last time I looked, longing for God to judge your enemies and send them to everlasting hellfire is not what Jesus meant by love your enemies. And when he said pray for those who persecute you, I'm pretty sure he didn't mean ask God to mess them up real good. I'm pretty sure he meant pray that they will come home. Pray that they will take their place at the Lamb's feast. Pray that they will learn war no more. Pray for them. In 1 Corinthians 13:5, Paul says, love does not keep a record of wrongs. He's using an accounting term. It's a term for entering an item into a ledger so that it won't be forgotten. And Paul is saying, love doesn't keep a ledger of offenses. Love does not build up indebtedness. Love doesn't harbor a grudge. Love believes all things, that the Shemais in your life are children of God, loved eternally by God. And love bears all things, all the slings and arrows, rocks and dirts that Shammai can throw at you. And love hopes all things, that the kingdom of righteousness really is coming when the lion and the lamb will lie down together. And love endures all things, because it doesn't matter how you begin, it matters how you end. The moment Jesus won the victory on the cross wasn't when he uttered his last words, "It is finished." No, that was the announcement of a victory that by that point had already been won. The exact moment when the victory was won was when Jesus looked down at those who had nailed him to the cross and prayed for them. He prayed, "Father, forgive them." That's when he won. And don't think that your victory is any different. You can end up like David, or you can end up like Jesus. But only one was raised up on the third day. Father, sometimes the hurts are so deep and the wounds so grievous that they are ever before us, and we struggle to love. Our love can sometimes be a reluctant love, given grudgingly as something that hasn't been earned and certainly isn't deserved. Bind up our wounds and heal our hurts so that our hearts don't turn hard with hate and resentment. As you did not hold our sins against us, and as you do not keep a record of our wrongs, help us to not hold others' sins against them, or keep a record of their wrongs against us or against other innocents. For just as a kingdom built with swords must be maintained by swords, so also is a kingdom of love maintained by love. So, Father, teach us to love as you first loved us. In Jesus' name, amen.